Okay, it's Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. This is Sunday, the 5th of November. What I want to do today is to talk about Abraham Lincoln's reelection in 1864 and some of the dubious electioneering that went on during that period and ballot counting. So let me just get started. Give me 1 second to pull up a little bit of my notes. What happened is that a few days ago, the Washington Post ran an article that characterized the Democrats in the 1864 election of cheating, and particularly with the soldier vote. But the interesting thing about that is that the soldier vote ended up going almost 80% for Lincoln. So their analysis is faulty, but the Washington Post is a former newspaper, so that's about what you can expect out of them. Here's what I want to explain to lay the groundwork. First, when the Civil War started in 1861, there had never been an important election during wartime. And there was really no way for the soldiers in the field to vote, generally speaking, without going back home to vote. And this was probably intended at the time that the regulations were set up in the individual states, because nobody wanted the military, controlled by the central government, to have control of so much of the potential voting persons, the voters. And that's what would happen if you gave the soldiers the vote. They did not want the military to be running the government, basically, is what this boiled down to. At least that appears to be the proper interpretation. What happened in 1862, the 1862 election, which was the first election following the start of the Civil War, it was a congressional election. And since the soldiers could not go home to vote, and voters were generally angry with the war, the fact that they were in a war. What happened is that the Republicans lost 27 seats in the House of Representatives. It was a major setback for the Republicans. Now, these votes were in the Union loyal states, so they included none of the 11 states of the Confederacy. So they lost 27 seats in that 1862 election. Lincoln, of course, was looking at this carefully, and he realized that what he needed to do was to get the soldier vote in his camp. And to do that, the states, and of course the Republican parties in the states, realized they needed to make a change so that the soldiers could vote. I think a total of 17 states did make changes which would enable soldiers to vote in the fields, but some of them still had to go back to their home states to vote. So after the Washington Post article, it reminded me when I saw the headline that there was an article somewhere else that it had come to a different conclusion. And that article is in the New York Times, another former newspaper, and it goes back to November 7th, 2014. It's by Dr. Jonathan White, who has written a book on the election of 1864 and the soldier vote. So let me just sort of summarize what he says about that. One of the most notable aspects of the 1864 election was the participation of Union soldiers. 19 northern states enacted legislation permitting soldiers to vote away from home. Unfortunately, taking the ballot to the battlefield opened up the door to fraud, intimidation, and coercion. Several Democrat operatives in Baltimore, for example, were caught stuffing Democrat ballots into New York soldiers' absentee voting envelopes. Now, let me just pause here to make a point. That is the incident that the Washington Post, a former newspaper, wrote their article about. The listeners should understand, or viewers should understand, that in those days, the ballots were often color-coded. There was no secret ballot. In other words, if you were carrying around a yellow ballot, that meant you were going to vote the yellow ticket, which might be Republican or Democrat. If you were carrying around a green one, that meant you were going to vote the green ticket. If you put it in the box, yellow or green, everybody knew how you were voting. So it's important to realize that at this time, there was no secret ballot. Okay, I'll continue with, what's his name? Jonathan White's article. The Republicans were no less intent on manipulating the soldier vote. They were no less intent than the Democrats. And, says Dr. White, they were far more successful in using their control of the federal government to ensure Lincoln's victory. Assistant Secretary of War Charles A. Dana remembered years later that, quote, all the power and influence of the War Department was employed to secure the re-election of Mr. Lincoln, close quote. This was no overstatement. Dana's recollections align with the historical evidence from the campaign itself. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton used his immense power to bring military voters into line, making sure they voted for Lincoln. Let me just sort of pause here to add, keep in mind, the military reports to the Secretary of War, who is Edwin M. Stanton, and that is part of the executive branch of the federal government. Stanton reports to Lincoln. So what this means is, as Secretary of War, which is equivalent to our Secretary of Defense today, he had a lot of control over the administration of the armies in the field. So let me get started again. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton, or let me continue again. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton used immense power to bring military votes into line, making sure that they voted for Lincoln or kept their democratic opinions to themselves. Stanton dismissed dozens of officers from the Union Army in the months leading up to the election, with at least one dismissal targeting multiple Democrats at once. When Republican Senator Edwin Morgan of New York informed Stanton that a number of quartermaster clerks had endorsed General George B. McClellan for president, and McClellan was running for president on the Democrat ticket, the principal opponent to Lincoln. When these quartermaster clerks endorsed George McClellan for president, Stanton dismissed all 20 of them. When one of the clerks protested his dismissal, an unsympathetic Stanton replied, quote, when a young man receives his pay from an administration and spends his evenings denouncing it in offensive terms, he cannot be surprised if the administration prefers to have a friend on the job, close quote. Imagine some President Trump doing that today, or even President Biden, you know? That's pretty bold. Stanton made very little effort to hide the partisanship behind his decisions. When he learned that one of his quartermasters was, quote, betting against, close quote, the Republican candidate for governor in Indiana, he boasted to a White House gathering, quote, I reduced him to a captain and ordered him south just the other day, close quote. Democrats came to believe that Stanton was taking these sorts of steps in order to influence the Army vote, and many Democratic officers learned to keep quiet during the campaign so that they would not receive Stanton's wrath. Colonel Durbin Ward of the 17th Ohio, for example, claimed that he was, quote, driven to be cautious, close quote, because publicly speaking his political opinions, quote, might cost me my commission, close quote. A Massachusetts artillerist similarly worried that if he voiced his political opinions, he would be called a copperhead, quote, a copperhead, and perhaps a poor cuss like me might get shot, close quote. Perhaps the most egregious political favoritism involved furloughs. Officers throughout the Union armies granted furloughs for Republican soldiers to go home to vote, while Democrats were kept in the field. A Pennsylvania election commissioner reported that, quote, Democrats were threatened to be sent to the front if they voted, close quote, while an Illinois soldier noted that his regiment was polled, quote, to see how many would vote for Lincoln if they got a chance to go home, close quote. Can you imagine that? Show me a show of hands of those of you who are going to vote for Trump, and then we'll see that your regiment gets to go home. If you're going to vote for Biden, your regiment stays here in Afghanistan. Some soldiers were willing to sacrifice their principles in order to attain a ticket home for the election. A few days after the election, Corporal George Buck of the 20th Michigan Volunteers reported to General McClellan some of the incidents he had witnessed in the campaign. The power of the military, he wrote, had been used without stint to keep soldiers from voting Democratic. Soldiers were offered promotion if they would vote for Lincoln, while Democrats were reduced in the ranks or a place in the front during every engagement if they chose to vote for you, close quote. Buck knew of hundreds of soldiers who voted for Lincoln under protest and hundreds more of your most ardent admirers. He's addressing McClellan as a candidate. So he's talking about the admirers of McClellan. Hundreds of more of your ardent admirers who did not vote at all, close quote. As evidence, he pointed out that his regiment had cast only 190 votes in the election, even though more than 300 men were qualified to vote. Historians often point out that Lincoln won 78% of the soldier vote in 1864, but they rarely scratch beneath the surface of that statistic. Clearly, some soldiers were intimidated or coerced into voting for Lincoln. Other Democrats in the Army most likely crossed party lines because they believed Lincoln was the best candidate to restore the Union. But they did not necessarily endorse his positions on other political issues like emancipation. And many others, like those in George Buck's regiment, simply did not vote, rather than run the risk of being labeled a Democrat by their officers. Indeed, many Democratic soldiers abstained from voting in 1864 because they saw Lincoln as a, quote, abolitionist, close quote, while they viewed their own party as, quote, disloyal for calling the war a failure in its national platform. This is one of the things that the Democrat Party claimed, that Lincoln's war had been a failure. General McClellan, who was the Democratic presidential candidate, only partially endorsed that because the platform also contained a commitment to try to negotiate peace. And McClellan said that if he won the election, he would prosecute the war to the end. So historian White concludes, there is no doubt that a significant number of Union soldiers supported Lincoln's candidacy and platform, but the Army support was not nearly as universal as most historians have assumed. So I would just like to make the comment, because that article in the New York Times was 6 years ago during the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. There were, as you might remember in those days, readers could comment on the article. I guess they still can. And there were about 45 comments there. Many of them, well, most of them were really annoyed at the author's, Jonathan White's conclusion that Lincoln, was less than a saint. But a number of them, it was humorous to see, complained that, hey, vote counting corruption is a long tradition here in the United States. It's been going on in America for generations. There's nothing unusual about this. And it is true that Lincoln got 133,000 Union soldier votes compared to 17,000, I believe it was, for McClellan, whereas his overall popular vote margin was 350,000. So it wasn't a decisive factor in his overall margin that he got at during the 1864 election. But in August, when he wrote to his cabinet members, he asked the cabinet members to sign an envelope should be open the day after his election if he failed to win re-election, in which he said he thought that he would lose the election. So in August, he certainly felt he was going to lose the election, and it's pretty darn clear he used all the power that he could through the Secretary of War to control the soldier vote. There just doesn't seem to be any doubt about that. So of course, the reason I'm doing this article, discussing this Washington Post article now, is because clearly, you know, we're in a very tight election here, where Biden apparently has won the smallest of margins and under the funniest of circumstances, suspicious circumstances. And if these New York Times readers who are traditionally, you know, Democrat Party members admitted 6 years ago that, you know, corruption in voting and ballot counting is a long American tradition that, you know, we should just live with. It's really interesting that, you know, if you were to ask these same people now whether that might apply to the 2020 election, no doubt they are amongst the others that are certain that everything was conducted properly and that there's no, you know, error in the ballot counting or anything like that. But let me go ahead and add a couple of other points that are pertinent here. If you get into the Reconstruction period, of course, one of the popular things that historians of today like to talk about is how evil the KKK was and how they ignored the voting rights of the blacks in the South and how they would attempt to stuff ballots and, you know, it did much worse things. It turns out that the KKK, the original KKK, was, according to Eric Foner of Columbia University, who is among the leading historians who hates Southerners. Well, basically, he hates white Southerners. And he admitted the Ku Klux Klan was out of business by 1872. I wouldn't want to say he hates Southerners, but his interpretation of what happened there was white Southerners, in his interpretation of Reconstruction, had nothing to do. They did nothing except abuse blacks and harass them, terrorize them. They had no problems of their own worthy of mention. I think that's well, maybe he would mention it, but not worthy of any attention. And I think that more accurately describes him. But my point is the KKK was out of business in 1872. Radical Reconstruction started in 1868, so that's 4 years. Well, even less than that, because it's out of business before at the first of 1872. Nonetheless, one of the things that put it out of business was the KKK Act of 1871, which enabled President Grant to use federal force against anyone that was, you know, interfering with elections. Here's the important point. For the KKK Act and similar acts, more than half of the money during the Reconstruction period, or at least up until 1894, more than half of it was not used in the South. It was used in 8 northern cities to, quote, you know, scare quote, police the elections because of Republican alleges of fraud in those elections by the Democrats, particularly the Irish and the Irish machines in big cities like New York. So to get more on that, I mean, it's, you know, it's another example of, I mean, either Grant was right and there was fraud, or Grant was wrong and he was using the power of the executive branch to suppress the Democrat vote in New York. It was one or the other. It's, here you have it. This is my book, U.S. Grant's Failed Presidency. You can get this for $20 at Amazon. If you want a signed copy, you can get it from me, $23, and just email me, Phil _Lee at me.com. Phil_Lee, LEIGH at me.com. Now, lastly, another book that I wrote is The Devil's Town. And this is about the gambling and criminal popularity of the spa town of Hot Springs, Arkansas, approximately 100 years ago during the Prohibition era. And it's interesting that even as a remote place like that, the same technique for controlling popular vote was used. The basic technique is quite reminiscent of what we've seen in 2020. One is the machine allows votes to be counted in areas where they don't have ironclad control. Then they determine, once those votes are counted, how many votes they need to release in order to beat that number. So even in this small town of Hot Springs, Arkansas, from the period from 1920 to 1965, the practice was there were two counties that fit into the district. The Montgomery County numbers were typically held up to make up whatever was needed to ensure victory based upon the returns in Garland County. So finally, in a group of GIs after World War II tried to clean up the politics in the city. And what they did is on election night, they tied up all of the telephone lines between Montgomery County and Garland County. So the votes were coming in Garland County, but this was before television. So they couldn't tell in Montgomery County how many votes they needed to pretend they actually got in order to ensure victory. But the difference was they had to get their votes in by, I think, midnight. They had to get them in. They couldn't just wait for days. They had to get those votes in. And so as long as the telephone lines were tied up, they didn't really know how many to submit. So they ended up submitting a number that was not big enough. You can learn about that. I mean, it's just really happened. It's all over America. This goes on all over America. And it's particularly crucial in a tight election, as we've just had. Anyway, this book, The Devil's Town, Hot Springs During the Gangster Era. If you want this, you can get it at Amazon for, I think it's $19. If you want it from me, I'll make it $22 signed. So thank you for watching. I appreciate your interest. And for Philip Lee and for Civil War Chat, that's a wrap.